Good morning. I'm very pleased today to be holding the Lunch and Learn session. This month, we're going to focus on Hispanic Heritage Month. As you know, Governor Cooper declared September 15th through October the 15th as Hispanic Heritage Month. And before we begin our session, I would like to go over a little ground of some of our ground rules. As you know, we will have a segment that we do have question and answer. So keep your microphone muted at all times. And if you have a question, please submit your questions to the chat, and we will try to make sure that our presenter is able to answer your questions. But if you have questions at any time during our session, please submit your questions to the chat and keep your microphones muted the entire time. We're going to go ahead and take this opportunity to begin our session. The Office of State Human Resources is pleased to recognize September 15th through October the 15th as Hispanic Heritage Month. This month-long celebration highlights the contributions and culture of Hispanic and Latinx Americans to our nation and society. The national theme for Hispanic Heritage Month is Esperanza, a celebration of Hispanic heritage and hope, commending the contributions Hispanics have made in the past, will make in the future, and how great our tomorrow can be if we hold on to our resilience and hope. September the 15th through October the 15th is significant to Hispanic culture because this month encompasses the independence days of many Latin American countries, including Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Mexico, and Chile. Over the last 30 years, the Hispanic population has grown dramatically to over 1 million. 9.6% of North Carolinians are Hispanic, and the population has grown to over 1 million Hispanics within the state of North Carolina. And their median age is only 25 years, indicating that this population represents a growing and important demographic of North Carolina. As the country becomes more aware of the challenges faced by underrepresented groups and the injustices surrounding race, equality, and inclusion, many are now looking at the past from a different worldview. As historical events take on a new meaning, lesser known and whitewashed ones are brought to light. These revived narratives, histories, and truths fill in the blanks and help us make sense of the partial lesson one-sided history taught us. So today we're going to have Raul Ramos, and he's going to unpack his synopsis in Remembering and Forgetting the Alamo, what the Texas story has to tell us about American history. And right now we have the opportunity to hear from him as he shares his expertise in borderlands history, Mexican American history, and the history of Texas. He is the author of Beyond the Alamo, Forging Mexican Ethnicity in San Antonio, 1821 through 1861, published by the University of North Carolina Press. He received his doctorate in history from Yale University with a focus on the American West. How has the Texas story shaped American history and culture? Right now, we're going to take that opportunity and join us for this session as we speak with our speaker, Dr. Raul Ramos. And I'm going to take this opportunity to introduce him as well. Dr. Ramos is an assistant professor of history at the University of Houston. He received his AB in history and Latin American studies from Princeton University in 1998 and his PhD in history from Yale University. He joined the history faculty at the University of Houston in 2002 from his position as assistant professor in history and ethnic studies at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. Dr. Ramos was a fellow at the William P. Clements Center for Southwest Studies at the Southern Methodist University from 2000 to 2001. Dr. Ramos's work invokes the intersection of a wide variety of historical subfields. At the University of Houston, he teaches Chicano a history to 1910, history of the American West, Texas to 1865, and borderlands history. His courses concentrate on historical processes such as conquest, colonization, social formations, migration, and cultural change. He is generally interested in the historical development of identities such as ethnic, national, regional, and class. His current project examines Mexican independence parades and fiestas or partidas in the American Southwest during the 1910 centennial. Dr. Ramos authored the book, again, Beyond the Alamo, Forging Mexican Ethnicity in San Antonio, 1821 through 1861, earning the San Antonio Conservation Society Publication Award, the Cleotide P. Garcia Tejano Book Commendation from the Texas State Hispanic Genealogical and Historical Association, the National Association for Chicano and Chicana Studies, or NACCS, the Tejas Book Award, and the T.R. Fehrenbach Book Award from the Texas Historical Commission. He also co-authored Recovering the Hispanic History of Texas, and he has published several articles. I am very pleased to present to you our speaker for today, Dr. Raul Ramos. Dr. Ramos?
Well, good late morning, good early afternoon. Thank you very much, Wendy and Gina, for this invitation to speak to all of you during this time of the year, where there seems to be more interest in Hispanic heritage, in the significance of the historical significance of the Latino population, and really thinking of all this with an eye towards the future. I mean, I'm a historian, and I look at the past, but I wouldn't be doing what I do if it wasn't because I understand how important the past is. The past is to creating a more fulfilling and equitable future for our entire community. And I think the work that you all are doing, both through these particular efforts, but in general, is really geared around helping people be the best version of themselves, to leave fulfilling work lives as well as home lives, and really find that kind of balance where people can bring their authentic self to the workplace, to all their interactions. And I think understanding something about the history of communities in the United States is one way to bring that kind of authenticity to the workplace and into all sorts of interactions. So I do feel this history is important. The Hispanic Heritage Month, as was mentioned earlier, falls at this time of the year, and it seems like sort of one of those odd monthly celebrations, in the sense that it starts in the middle of one month and goes to the middle of another month. But in any case, that timing is influenced by a couple of factors. Certainly within it, you have many independent states of a great number of Latin American nations. The one I'll be spending most time talking about will be Mexican independence, which was declared on September 15th, and we commemorate and celebrate on September 16th, often known as 16 de Septiembre. And one of the questions outside of Mexico folks, or in the United States, folks sometimes see Cinco de Mayo as Independence Day, and this is always a good opportunity to remind everyone that that's a commemoration of one particular battle against the French intervention in the 1860s, and not Mexican independence from Spain, which is celebrated on 16 de Septiembre. But I'm going to say a few more words about independence shortly. I do also believe that this date encompasses, at the end of this time frame, Columbus Day as well, or what was known as Columbus Day, sometimes known as Indigenous Peoples Day, or Dia de la Raza in other parts of the country. And certainly that discussion about what to even name that day, or whether to even recognize the former Columbus Day or the current Columbus Day, is tied into understanding this history and how the history impacts the present, and the role that history plays in understanding the past. So my hope is that that I bring up more questions than answers. That's my goal here today, which is that you should leave this with more questions to ask, with questions to ask of your past, of the past around you, of the past that other people bring with them in all these situations. Like I said, I wanted to begin by talking about Independence Day, and start by saying, if I were to ask you what you did on Independence Day, you would more than likely talk about July 4th, right? On 4th of July, you had a picnic, you had a barbecue with friends, you had the day off, and you maybe traveled before COVID, or perhaps you went to a parade, an Independence Day parade. And certainly we know that in most people's mind, if I mention Independence Day, they'll think automatically July 4th, 1776. But what if I told you that Independence Day, American Independence Day, July 4th, 1776, was an imported holiday to where I'm sitting right now here in Houston, Texas? Because in 1776, where I'm sitting right now, was not part of the 13 colonies, was not part of those colonies in rebellion against the British. Where I'm sitting right now was firmly in Spanish colonial Mexico, or New Spain, as it was called then. Independence Day, where I'm sitting, happened in 1810, on September 16, 1810. So perhaps it would be useful to kind of show you on this map exactly what we're talking about, the distance I'm referring to here. So if I were to show you where July 4th, 1776 happened, it happened somewhere around here. I'm sitting over here, right? July 4th was brought to Texas, was brought to the Southwest, was brought to California. Because in 1776, none of these areas were part of the United States, or what eventually became the United States. Those were the original 13 colonies. This is one thing we do as historians. We ask the important thing we're bringing up here is that history involves change over time, that the way things are now is not the way things always were, that the way things are now happened because of actions taken and didn't happen because of erosion or some kind of natural process. These are historical changes. And I bring this up because there's a way that we tend to talk about this part of the United States, the West and the Southwest, in an ahistorical way, as though it somehow exists outside of history. When we talk about events on the border between the United States and Mexico, we talk about the US-Mexico border as though it was always there, as though it was as though it was always the line dividing two nations, especially these two nations. And in fact, it was not. And Texas is an example of how that change happened and where that change happened. But again, as a historian, my job is to bring history back into that story, to bring historical context back into our discussions, and understand that once we do that, how we talk about these places in the present is more meaningful and more accurate and reflects the lives of people as they are living them today. So again, the border itself between the United States and Mexico is the product of historical actions and the product of historical events. In this case, it's the product of the United States invasion of Mexico in 1846. Again, another chapter in American history that tends to be overlooked. Again, this will be part of a broader discussion about not just avoiding or ignoring these events, but actually making them invisible, almost silencing them in the past. Let me start with perhaps the most famous symbol of Texas history and perhaps the central symbol to the story that we're talking about, and in this case represented in a building and an event that I'm willing to believe most of you have heard of, right? Which is the Battle of the Alamo. In a nutshell, the Battle of the Alamo took place in Texas in 1836, and involved, in fact, a defeat of the Texian rebels at the hands of the Mexican army, and that defeat took place at this fort, known as the Alamo. The Alamo is probably one of the most visited historic sites in the country, and this has been the subject of films, of songs, of television shows. I grew up with hearing the Disney version of Davy Crockett, and so it's a very well-known American story, not just a Texas story. But when we this is but I think the Alamo is worth looking at, not just for what we see when we see this building, what we think about when we see this building, but also what we are looking at and don't see. And essentially what I'm talking about here are elements that are hidden in plain sight. Like I said, most of you have seen this building before. My guess is that some of you might have even visited before. I don't know how. I wish I could see if maybe in the question and answer you can just tell me if you have been to the Alamo before. And certainly most people have seen images of it before they ever visited. And one of the things that most people, when they do see it, they see, it seems, and I'm willing to bet, Darnell, that when you went to it, like most people, the first time you see it, the first impression most people have is that it's a lot smaller than they remember it, or than they thought it would be when they read about it or saw it in film, or seen photos of it. And certainly that idea of scale, that it's smaller than it appears, which is the main reaction I hear, in some ways shows that gap between how something exists in our mind and then how something exists in actuality. And here we have the actual building in front of us. And again, there's a way that our mind affects how we see things. If we're looking at this building right now, there's certain features here that go unexplained. Let me give you an example. If I were to tell you, what are these alcoves between the columns and up top here, you probably never give it two thoughts. But those features are called nichos. They're actual pedestals where statues would be placed. It would be a statue of Mary, a statue of Joseph, a statue, in this case, because it's San Antonio, perhaps of St. Anthony, or San Fernando. So these are places places where statues are placed in any Catholic church, because what you're looking at is, in fact, a Catholic church, or a former Catholic church, as the case may be. But it's those architectural elements that are still visible, but devoid of their religious meaning, of their historical significance, and of their cultural meaning, is exactly what I'm talking about when I say, or this is an exact example of what we might call hidden in plain sight. In other words, that something that you're looking at is telling you something, but you don't see it without that kind of broader historical context. And the broader historical context here is that the Alamo itself was built as a Spanish mission, that it functioned as a mission church, that it was part of Spanish, that it was an important part of the Spanish colonial settlement in the area, and particularly engaging the indigenous populations in Texas. And that's another area that I think bears questioning when we look at the Alamo. I always ask audiences, who do you think built the Alamo? If this is a Spanish, in fact, a Spanish mission, did the Spanish priest build the Alamo? Well, I'm pretty sure that a single priest wouldn't be able to do it in his lifetime, not to mention wouldn't want to get his hands dirty when he had the indigenous people that he was converting. And in fact, you can imagine the construction process itself being part of the conversion process, teaching particular work habits and life habits. That this is a building that was built by indigenous hands. And so there we have it, the symbol of Texas, the symbol of Americans in Texas. One of the biggest symbols in American history, really, is a Spanish church built by indigenous hands, right? And again, we look at it, it's hidden in plain sight. But when you look at the Alamo, certainly I could ask 1,000 people, nobody would say, I see the product of Indian history here. But this is indigenous history, this is Mexican history, and this is American history. And therein lies my central point that I want to bring up today. When I'm invited to give talks on for this month, for Hispanic Heritage Month, I often ask, I'm often curious what people want to know. And certainly my sense is that, looking at another and referring to another part of the introduction, that since we just had a census, people feel who is the Latino, who are the Latino population, Latinos, Latinas, Latinx people, where did they come from? How did they all of a sudden appear? And my point is, it's very easy to see this as a sudden process, as appearing overnight, as a sudden immigration rush. What we don't see is the fact that Latinos and Latinas have been here from the beginning, and in fact from before this area was the United States. To see Latinx people, to see indigenous people as foundational, as a pillar of American culture and American society, and not just a contributor, but rather as the builders and people who have always been there. And if we erase that presence over those centuries, really, of course, if we don't understand that history, then it does look like people just got here, like people just appeared. What's even more fascinating when you study this history is how quickly this framing of Latinos as immigrants came in the American expansion into the West. It was in fact part of that first moment and part of that expansion. When I talk about July 4th being imported to Texas, or exported into Texas, if you will, I'm using a verb here to talk about July 4th as being brought, as a culture that's brought into Texas, a national identity that's brought to Texas. It's not a national identity that existed in Texas beforehand. So my goal today is to make visible the invisible. And again, I think we can look at that historically, for sure, in the context that I'm talking about, the importance of visibility in the past, helping us understand presence and visibility in the present, and the visibility in the present as an integral part of understanding how we are all part of the same community. The visibility at work, visibility at home, in our neighborhoods. All too often, we see that Latinos and Latinas are forced into the margins and forced into back rooms, into kitchens, rather than front of the housework. It's working in the background, and it working in the background, you don't see that contribution. You don't see the critical work that people are doing in farms, in factories, in offices, in homes, and that work is ubiquitous and continues to be invisible. But let me return to this question, and let me return to this question of historical invisibility and talk about the ways that the language that we use to talk about the past and the role that that language has to the language that we use to talk about the past to turn Mexican people in particular and Latinos generally into immigrants, into that almost inescapable category. And the first place I would talk about is returning back to the Texas story, and interrogate a little bit more closely the role that Americans played in the Texas War and the so-called Texas Revolution, and the way that their participation in that revolution and the role they had in that revolution excludes the larger historical context, the broader historical context in which they're acting. And now, when perhaps the central figure in Texas history for Anglo-Americans is Stephen F. Austin. Stephen F. Austin immigrated to Texas in 1821. Now, I emphasize he immigrated to Texas because that's actually what he did. Remember, he's moving from from the United States in Kentucky and Missouri to Texas, which is in Mexico, which is a state in Mexico. Well, actually part of the state of Coahuila, Texas, but it's a state in Mexico. So he's technically moving from one country to another. Now, I don't know what else to call moving from one country to another country other than immigration. And certainly if we place, if we're to accurately describe what Austin is doing, that's the term we would use. Now, perhaps the most popular term that's used to describe what Austin is doing is that he's a colonist. And actually that's not entirely incorrect. He does come to Texas as part of a colonial policy that Mexico had developed in 1821. Remember, this is actually right at the point of Mexican independence. Mexico decided that they needed to increase the number of settlements in Texas for a variety of reasons. One big one being that the settlements that did have were constantly being attacked by Comanches peoples and Apache peoples, and so in order to make those settlements more permanent, to make them economically thrive, and to essentially protect Mexico's claim to this frontier, that they opened that area to foreign immigration. By the way, that policy expanded to European immigrants as well, and in fact, many Irish immigrants came to Texas during the 1820s as part of that same colonial policy. And I should also note that this policy was a departure from the Spanish approach. The Spanish were sort of notoriously prevented immigration from other countries and empires, and basically that's why you see Spaniards going from all corners of Spain going into different parts of Latin America. And it's during these independence periods when immigration opened up beyond Spain, and in fact, in some ways, I would say replicating the model that the United States had set up in their own colonies after independence, and so seeing that success, I think Mexico wanted to follow in that model, and when they did that. You might say it was short-sighted in some ways, but they opened up Texas, and the people who took advantage of that policy, took advantage of that invitation to immigrate to Texas, were by and large not just Americans, but American Southerners. They were coming from all over the South, but particularly from cotton-growing areas. And again, they saw the expansion of Texas as really the expansion of the South. Certainly, if you study American history, and you know this in the Civil War, that Texas was one of the Confederate states, and so in the sense, it was the growth of the South into Texas that we really should focus at and this is actually one sort of sub question that we, again, as historians, haven't really looked at. We look at all American westward expansion as the same, when there were differences. There are different time periods, different places, and certainly Texas falls in this intersection of a southern American West, of a southern westward march, if you will, and what I like to call in my classes the Southern American Dream. And we should understand there's two critical parts to the Southern American dream: land and slavery. And those Americans who immigrated into Texas brought enslaved people with them, and were there to cultivate land, in particular, growing the cash crop of cotton, which at that point was starting to become incredibly lucrative on the world market as industrialization boomed in both in the East Coast and across the Atlantic, in Britain and France as well, the two biggest consumers of cotton during this time. In any case, so was Austin an immigrant or was he a colonist? That, as I said before, he might not have called himself an immigrant, but he learned Spanish, he became Catholic, he followed all the rules that the colonization laws required. He became a Mexican citizen as part of his immigration to Texas. But in Texas history, in Texas history classes, he's still referred to as a colonist. And the main reason to emphasize that versus immigrant is, again, to connect the presence of the United States in Texas in an ahistorical way. And basically saying, well, Texas wasn't originally part of the United States, but it was always meant to be part of the United States. It kind of naturalizes what is a historical and normalizes a historical process. I'll fast forward through a decade and a half of Texas history to emphasize that you have more Americans, more Southerners begin to immigrate into Texas, and pretty soon American and American Southerners and enslaved people that they forced immigrated with them outnumbered Mexican inhabitants almost 10 to 1, and the Mexican government took notice. And in 1830, put a hold, a stop, if you will, on American immigration, because reports came in, well, for two reasons. First of all, reports came in saying that Americans weren't following the rules; they were breaking all the rules of the colonization, of the colonial regulations, or the colonization regulations. And secondly, slavery had been abolished by Mexico in 1829, and the issue of slavery in Texas was left open. The Mexican Texans, or Tejanos as they're known, who had essentially served as middlemen to bring Anglo colonists into Texas, always found a way to get an exemption for these immigrants, to allow them to encourage them to come into Texas, and but certainly there was going to be an end to that allowance. It wasn't going to be open-ended and essentially without restrictions, which was expected by Anglo immigrants and which was expected by Southerners. I mean, this is, again, a long-standing issue in the American South. Texas then takes advantage of other rebellions going on in Mexico during this time, and decides to attempt to expel the Mexican government, Mexican army, Mexican presence from Texas. And they do so by declaring independence on March 2nd, 1836. Well, I should fast forward. I mean, I should back up a second and say that the first battles of this rebellion started in October and November of 1835. But by 1836, it was clear that those first rebellions were amounting to what they decided was an independence movement. But again, I want to bring up a key point here. The Texas Declaration of Independence then was signed in 1836, And of all the signers of the Texas Declaration of Independence, two were Tejano, Francisco Ruiz and Jose Antonio Navarro, whose signatures you have here on a facsimile of the Declaration of Independence. And so of all the signers of the Texas Declaration of Independence, only Ruiz and Navarro were the only two that were actually born in Texas. All the other signers had immigrated to Texas and had moved to Texas at most 15 years earlier, as was the case with Austin, but more likely sometime up until 1830. So really only somewhere between 15 and 5 years earlier. So again, they had only been there around a decade, but we're now declaring independence from Mexico. And again, in the frame of American history, they are defending their homeland. They are defending their, they become the defenders of Texas and the defenders of the Alamo. And this is where the narrative shifts. This is where Mexican people who, again, were the original inhabitants of this area, who are even supporting and participating in this movement against the Mexican government, they start to become defined as the invaders, as the outsiders in this particular scenario. And certainly when we see this in how, not just in talking about, not particularly in the time that this is happening, but very soon after, and in almost immediately, in the way that the Alamo, the story of the Alamo and the Texas history becomes written and depicted in word and in image. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about by focusing on one particular image. And this is a painting that is actually, this is a close-up of what is a large mural, or a painting that's almost the size of a mural. It's an oil painting that currently sits in the Texas legislature in the Senate chamber in the rear, one of two panels that is located in the rear of the hall, excuse me, of the chamber. And it's a painting called Dawn of the Alamo, painted in the 1870s. And one of the things that we see in this that I think that's important to understand about this painting is that first of all, obviously the artist wasn't present. This is a depiction that comes from how this a kind of imagining of what the story must have been like, of what the place must have been like. And it's how histories become romanticized. You see, I'll focus on a couple of figures here. We'll see, this is Travis, standing, fighting. We see, this is Davy Crockett down here swinging old Bessie, his rifle having run out of ammunition. He uses it to swing around and continue fighting. But what I think is most importantly are the depictions of the Mexican army in these cases as a kind of nameless, faceless horde that's overtaking the brave, the heroic last stand of the Texians who are fighting to the death at the Alamo. This depiction is one to create. Well, I mean, we have to think about for a second, what impression is this creating? It's who is heroic here and who's depicted as cowardly. Here, Travis is about to be stabbed in the back, in this case, by a Mexican soldier who's sneaking up behind him versus fighting heroically. Same goes for Crockett. One of the, again, looking at historic documents, several Mexican lieutenants in the Army who took notes during the battle and after the battle, talked about Crockett because his fame preceded him, and talked about how he was captured at the end and executed with all the survivors. And so rather than a story where everybody fought to the death, again, in my mind, they did fight to the death because they died, but they died being executed at the end of the battle. Now, their execution was, a crime as well, and in this particular situation. But again, and to me, it doesn't diminish the bravery it took in the fight. But to depict the actual battle and and what we should remember from the battle, is this becomes the way that Mexican people are immediately become suspect, become questionable in the mind, and certainly become a kind of invading horde in the story of Texas. Here's a kind of close up of Crockett swinging old Bessie and fighting in kind of hand-to-hand combat here. And again, the dark, faceless hordes of Mexicans who are invading the Alamo in this case. Now, again, I just gave you a historic context. Crockett had only been in Texas a few months, right, as part of a group of so-called volunteers, mercenaries, who marched to Texas to find their glory, to fight for what had been sold to them as a heroic cause, to fight Santa Anna. And certainly, but he never lived in Texas, to be honest. He wasn't even a colonist, not to mention an immigrant. Yet you don't go into a town in Texas that doesn't have a street named after Crockett. And he stands in the pantheon of half of in the history of Texas, of who is remembered in Texas, and again, much to the erasure and invisibility of the Mexican population that was there before. I think of this broadly as a moment of the birth of Texas, and certainly this is the way it was described in a film. And again, as I mentioned before, there's the battle itself, and then there's the way the story has been depicted and continues to be depicted. It's in 1915, D.W. Griffith's production company makes a film version of the Battle of the Alamo called Martyrs of the Alamo. And you see here in a poster from the film, for advertising the film, they even called it The Birth of Texas. Now, again, if you study any American history, you know that D.W. Griffith's production company made the film Birth of a Nation a couple of years later. That becomes a critical step in developing in what we might call the lost cause narrative of the American South, and changing and shapes the way Americans, both in the North and the South, think of the Civil War as a war that was oppressive to white Southerners, and certainly looks at and not only paints Union Army and those looking to change the South as carpetbaggers and in particularly negative ways. But again, if you look at Birth of a Nation, you see that the hero in that film is it's about the birth of the Ku Klux Klan as the last line of defense against the destruction of Southern culture in a Southern way. And again, Southern culture becoming a kind of normalized Southern culture versus Southern white culture. So there's a kind of de-racialization in certain times, and then any other culture that's not white is the one that gets described in a kind of racial way. As I mentioned before, this started happening right after the battle. Over and over again, you see Tejanos born in San Antonio, whether in the Mexican period or early on, talking about how they're treated like foreigners in their own land. In fact, in a speech in 1854 during a political campaign, Jose Antonio Navarro, one of those who signed the Texas Declaration of Independence, says in a public forum, "Why do we appear like foreigners in the very land of our birth?" And I think that encompasses not only the historic view and how this historic view happened almost immediately. Remember, this is 1854, right? Only years after not only the Battle of the Alamo in 36, but the U.S. invasion of Mexico in 46 and 47, and ultimately the treaty that brings that where the United States takes possession of almost half of Mexico and creates the modern border in 1848. So the Mexican population who lives in this land then are rendered foreigners, and really never. So whether you immigrated yesterday, or your parents immigrated, as was my case, or if your grandparents immigrated, or if you never immigrated, but rather the country, the nation expanded to include you. In all these cases, your status is of foreigner and is of immigrant, as though no other status, and especially the status of American, becomes unavailable to the Latino population. So that's in a nutshell, sort of my argument about how the erasure of Mexican people and the framing of Mexican people as outsiders contributes to the historic invisibility of the Latinx population in the United States. And again, if we're going to acknowledge that and first of all change that invisibility and make visible the place and the participation and really the foundational role that Latinx people played in not only in the Southwest but in all other parts of the U.S. and really think of the U.S. in a continental context, which would help us to even understand American involvement in Haiti, which needs to be part of the conversation about what's going on in the border just last week in Del Rio. Again, this kind of historical context, this sort of broader view of the United States and Latin America being much more integrated and much more involved would help us understand not only that past, but understand where we are today in the present. If I could just say one thing, it's that in making people visible in the past and in the present, it's not just about adding Mexican faces or talking about the contribution of people, but rather the story itself needs to change, because where we are now relied on a story that excluded Latinx people. If we start including them but don't think that the story changes, then we didn't learn the lesson of why Latinx people were excluded from that story to begin with. We have to ask the question, why was it important for Latinx people to be rendered foreign, to be made foreigners in their own land, to be categorized as a community, as a population that didn't belong and doesn't belong, and not only what role that played in building the world that we have today, but if we're going to change that story in the past, it has to have reverberations that take apart that, or that examine at least why that was the case before, and what new story we need to be telling in the future to make this to make not only people visible in the past but visible in the present. I think that visibility and understanding that story will make interactions more fulfilling. We'll realize that people come from different places, have different stories to tell, have different engagements with American colonialism, American imperialism, if you will, and are participating and engaging and creating their own history throughout. As invisible as they have been rendered by the historical narrative, people never acted like they were invisible. They acted in ways to make their community better and to make their lives better. And I would say they're continuing to act in that way today. So I'm happy to answer any questions about 19th century history, any questions about other chapters in history of the Southwest, in history of and in really the broader Latinx history across the United States.
Thank you, Dr. Ramos, for your presentation. It was very, very informative. I do have one quick question before we, well, I do see a question here that is coming from the chat, and checking to see if it's the end of it or if it's just a message. It's a message to you. So when you get a chance, Dr. Ramos, take a look at that message that was sent to you. But I do have a question, and it's in regards to language. I noticed that you stated that Stephen F. Austin, that he learned the language of the inhabitants of the land. So he learned Mexican, well, he learned Spanish,
Right.
and from the Mexicans, and he assimilated into their population in order to grow and expand. So I could see how he could be viewed as an immigrant or as a colonist. But with that being said, he learned the language. And do you feel that people not learning the language of Latinos or Hispanic people, do you think that that contributes to them being rendered invisible?
I think there might be, a couple of ways of looking at this. I'm actually very excited that, one of the projects that was started here at the University of Houston and has been going on now for 26, 27 years is a project called the Recovering the Hispanic Heritage Project, the Recovering the Hispanic Heritage of the United States project. And the Recovery Project had one goal in particular. It picked a year, 1960, and it picked a goal. And the goal was everything actually printed by a printing press in Spanish, in the Spanish language that existed before 1960 in what is now the United States, right? So, but as soon, looking at the first printing press brought into Texas in the 1820s, the first printing presses brought into California and to New Mexico, those printing presses were printing in Spanish, right? In other words, there is a long, rich, and deep American history written and preserved in Spanish. There's a book that a colleague of mine at Princeton wrote called An American Language, which is the history of Spanish politics in the United States by Rosina Lozano. Dr. Lozano examines the way, post-1848, the way American politics and inclusion of Mexican people into American culture required Spanish, and in fact, the American government took those cues and conducted most of New Mexico's business, for instance, in Spanish, and translated laws. Look, the Texas Republic, which set itself up after the war in 1836, published all their laws in Spanish and in English. So, in other words, we're a bilingual country. As much as we'd like to talk about the United States as a monolingual country, and I think rather than saying we're a bilingual country because of some law or some dictate or some mandate, we're an organically multilingual country. There's some countries that are officially bilingual. Certainly, if you go to Canada, there are provinces, in Canada that are francophone and anglophone, and there it's a role of official government policy. But our Constitution is purposefully silent on language. our Constitution purposely doesn't say English is the, it has to be the language that we speak in the United States. And I see that as acknowledging that that belonging to a community, being part of a community, participating in the world around you should not be contingent on a language. That's going to change historically. That's going to change for organic reasons. And look, I think I remember the summer 2 years ago, literally the number one most popular song in the United States was Despacito, right? When Spanish songs can become the most popular pop music songs in the country, we know that was not by any kind of official dictate or government policy. People vote with their feet. People vote with their clicks. And again, our culture is changing, whether we like it or not. And so certainly, I think immigrant communities have learned that they know for sure, if you want to succeed, particularly in particular contexts and particular environments, you need to learn English. The history in the United States, and particularly the history of our Latinx community, is one where for generations, if we spoke Spanish in school, we were punished. If we were told not to speak, my parents were told not to speak to us in Spanish at home because it would, we would suffer as students that way. Instead, we now value that, and we see that it's valuable not only for creating an inclusive community at home, but it's also to participate in the larger global economy and global context that the United States, that we see that the more we think broadly, the more that we can create a more integrated world that we're able to again succeed both locally and in these communities as well. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question around Spanish, but I think it is a historic question. Look, personally, I wrote a book that deals with Texas during the Alamo period. And, that is one area, that is one theme that there is no shortage of books on the Alamo. And, it's a very popular subject, probably second only to the Civil War and maybe World War II in terms of American history. But what I brought to this was essentially saying, have we looked at the fact that many of the government documents, the letters, the participants in Texas history spoke and wrote and lived in Spanish, and their documents were not present in any of these histories. So again, my point, at least as a historian, is you need to know the language of the place that you're looking at for the period that you're looking at. And for generations, historians didn't look at Spanish language documents, and we can discuss why not. And I think there's a wide variety of reasons, but I think not unrelated to what I was saying before, which is that wasn't seen as a central part of the story, and it contributed to the silencing of Latino participation in that time.
Thank you very much for that answer.
Sure.
I've gotten this question, and it's a common one, and I'm interested to hear your take on it as well. Can you tell us the difference between Hispanic, Latino, and Latinx?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's probably the most common question I get. And look, I'm over 50 years old, so I've if you live long enough, you've seen that these terms of self-identification have changed over time, and they continue to change. And whatever it is now is going to change 10 years from now. Certainly in this internet connected world, it's going to change even faster. So as a historian, I can say those terms have historic meaning, have different historic meanings, but they also have different meanings in context. The terms themselves are going to be one thing in California and another thing in New York City and another thing in Chicago and another in Houston. and they'll mean different things for different generations. My parents might use a different term. My kids are going to use a different term. So I know I'm not making things easier. Let me give kind of broad, sort of broader context or view. Certainly, I'll start from the narrow to the broad. Narrowly speaking, Mexican American are Americans of Mexican descent, Mexican heritage, right? Another term for Mexican American is also Chicano. That is a term that really became popular during the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. And you often hear the Mexican American civil rights movement described as the Chicano movement. And when I first started college, it was a term that was still popular, particularly among more politically active Mexican Americans. Hispanic it would be the next sort of broader term. Certainly, Hispanic, and on the one hand, implies people with of heritage that connects to Spain, right? So España, right? Hispanic, essentially people that are of Spanish descendancy, but it specifically means a connection to the former colonies of Spain or Latin America. Now, Hispanic is a term that during the Nixon administration becomes the government sort of hones on that term, and it becomes a term that gets used in the census. And really, in the 1980s, you see it become the kind of nationally used term, particularly by the government. It was broad, maybe too broad, but it was, and again, politically, it would probably be seen more in terms of, became a kind of Chamber of Commerce type term as well, and one that was less around political organizing and more around, maybe you could say, economic organizing. More recently, and again, I think with a focus on, rather than focusing on Spain as Hispanic does, and instead of focusing on Latin America, Latino became a more common term that applies to essentially the same population, but people from of Latin American descendancy. That includes the Caribbean, by the way. And by the way, Latin American had been used before. In the 50s and 60s, you saw terms like Pan American or you saw the rise of an organization called LULAC, with the League of United Latin American Citizens, again focusing on that term, Latin American. More recently, I think in a move to expand particularly the inclusive space of identities. One feature of Spanish is that it's a gendered language. Nouns are always gendered, so you would be Latino or Latina. But again, in a move to be more gender inclusive, I would say mostly young Latinos and Latinas have embraced the term Latinx, which is a way of degendering essentially what was a gendered term. And so that's sort of the broad range. My own opinion is, that I'm, first of all, just an observer, and secondly, I think the most important thing is to ask people what they want to be called. That's, I think, the most accurate term of how people would be referred to.
Thank you again, Dr. Ramos. I do have another question for you real quick.
Uh-huh.
There's a comment that someone made that those who do not know history may be destined to repeat it. And they're interested in the role of that Andrew Jackson later played.
Yeah, so Andrew Jackson is, president president that's sort of going some reevaluation, I would say. Looking sort of broadly in the history, in American history, Jackson plays a kind of um, depending on what you're looking at in American history, he is shifting how the United States sees itself. I think in the broad context of what I'm talking about in terms of American expansion into the West and really and American involvement in the entire hemisphere, if you will, Andrew Jackson plays a powerful and I would add destructive role in essentially expanding expanding American power on the continent, and that includes the forced migration of indigenous people or the massacres of indigenous people along the way. So indigenous people really, really that's the point in which they are written out essentially of the American story. They're, he's sort of attributed with the Trail of Tears, the forced migration of indigenous peoples into Oklahoma. How this fits in the Texas story, I think, is twofold. One, it's in essentially his role in projecting American, the idea of American belonging beyond those original 13 colonies, beyond the Appalachian Mountains. He basically took those Western territories, and even though they weren't part of the United States yet, they became part of the United States in his imagination and in the imagination of what it meant, how the nation was imagining itself at that time. In a very specific way, one of his proteges was Sam Houston, who was a senator in Tennessee at that time. Sorry, like I said, there's thunderstorms here in Houston. So Sam Houston was a protege of Andrew Jackson, and so one of the, in some ways, Jackson's vision was brought to Texas, and really, I think, brings up in my mind, one of the larger silences, if you will, which is and bigger contradictions regarding Texas. And in this time and period, certainly over the last year and a half, ever since the murder of George Floyd, but certainly since Charlottesville, United States has been Americans have been rethinking their history, particularly the history of race in the United States, the role of slavery in the United States, and how we've talked about the Civil War. And so the Civil War itself is going through another reevaluation by historians and by popular communities. That same re-examination is not happening in Texas. There's a way that Texas kind of got a pass, and that to me is one of the bigger challenges. Is we will, at some point, we as Americans need to link the history of slavery with and race with American expansion on the continent. And so, actually, going back to the first question about what is Hispanic and what is Latino, I would add another question, which is Hispanic a race? And certainly, the census kind of punted on that, right? The census basically said, just created a whole, second category. So there's race and, all sorts of options there. But then there's the Hispanic yes/no question. And so rather than saying is Hispanic a race, it's just Hispanic, right? And it exists in some kind of nether world, if you will. And that, in a sense, to me, is the conundrum we're in. We're in a country that is engaging this larger question of how our history, the role that, asking questions about the role that race has played in our history, but not asking the question how that's expanded into the West and how that applies to Mexican peoples, to indigenous peoples, to Asian Americans. Pacific Islanders in Hawaii. All of these in all of these questions, I think when we look at what's happening, it looks like race, but we don't currently have a language in our culture to talk about that. I know that's a long answer to the Andrew Jackson question, but I feel, that's that if we look at Andrew Jackson historically, that's going to be the place where we're going to make that connection. I can see some of the questions here too. There was one about reparations. You want me to talk about that in a second? Again, actually there, there are two. Let me talk about two particular moments. One kind of historical around the civil rights movement. There was political organizing during the civil rights movement across the Southwest, most notably in New Mexico. There were a couple of takeovers of national parks by Chicano activists to essentially to reclaim land that was communal at one point in these communities, and certainly this concept of communal lands, of ejidos, of tierras populares, comes out of not only out of a historic belonging in the Southwest, but actually a kind of extension and to an extension from Mexico and Latin America into the United States of essentially the pushing back on the dispossession of communal lands by indigenous peoples through the privatization of land and through corporate ownership throughout Mexico and throughout Latin America. And so the largest movement of those came up right at the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1992 in Mexico City. And you saw the kind of Zapatista rebellion that took place in Mexico extending along, particularly up into the United States, and becoming popular during these times. But in a very specific way, you're starting to see some more legal action around land in particular. So land's really the area, I think, we're to look at reparation, looking at historical, looking at history critically, particularly in South Texas. And so you see going litigation around the way the underhanded ways, if you will, that Anglo ranchers took land from Mexican ranchers in South Texas. And so you see several court cases that are trying to at least either get compensation for that land or actually get the land back. Look, again, this is central to Texas history. Perhaps the most popular symbol of Texas of a certain generation was the King Ranch. In fact, Ford F-150 came out with a King Ranch version for a while. That it symbolized, symbolized everything around ranching in Texas and the West, and projected a kind of image of being American. And the King Ranch actually became kind of a global symbol of the American West and of American ranching. That's that's where you see certain kinds of longhorn cattle coming out, and other cattle breeds. But the King Ranch became as large as it was because King and Clayburgh were able to use a variety of tactics, some super legal, right, which is basically getting people in debt to sell their land cheaper during periods of drought. And again, they could buy that land because they had access to capital markets in New York and London, to underhanded ways, sheriff sales, questioning ownership, forcing people to go to courthouses and hire lawyers in order to prove that they own land, and then in the end, and doing all this in English. And so there were sort of ways that land was coerced. And so that's one area that we're seeing, the kind of heroes of Texas history becoming what they were at the expense of Mexican people.
Dr. Ramos, I have a comment and a question from someone.
Sure.
They said that they have an old family picture of.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, you cut out again. Could you say that?
Yes, someone has an old family picture of a Texan soldier with a gun in his hand on a horse, and someone had written on the photograph, lion killer. Do you know if lion killer had a special meaning in the Texas Mexican War?
Um, it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't ring a bell. I mean, there are a lot of, you know, there's an entire history in Texas um, of essentially terrorizing and violence against Mexican communities um, throughout the early 20th century. Um, Perhaps the most famous symbol of Texas are the Texas Rangers, right? That everyone's heard of the Texas Rangers. They're the kind of state police force, if you will. The Texas Rangers were essentially um, unaccountable roving uh, uh, vigilantes in South Texas. We have uh, historians have documented hundreds of cases of lynchings and literal lynchings and killings of Mexican people at the hands of the Texas Rangers and other extrajudicial killings, oftentimes photographed and as kind of trophies. And certainly this is part of the legacy and the history of Texas. It's a chapter in Texas history people probably don't want to talk about. But again, if we're to take people who are invisible and make them visible again, we need to ask the question, would the Texas we have today, be the Texas we have today without those images, without that chapter of terrorizing of Mexican people? So I'm not sure if that picture contributes to that or is part of that or not. I will say, and I will also say that Americans were not terribly thrilled. They did not welcome Texas with open arms in 1836. In fact, just the opposite. The reason Texas didn't become a state in 1836 and had to wait until after the U.S. invasion until just before the U.S. invasion of Mexico in 1845 under James K. Polk was because of essentially the distaste that the Americans had for a kind of threatening Texas and really based on slavery and kind of vigilantism, if you will, that Texas had profited from. And so that in some ways Texas spent a decade trying to run away from that, but that that image of Texas as Texas has kind of these two images. I think most recently, and I think we have to talk about the kind of indelible image that was seen all over the country last week when the 15,000 Haitian immigrants who crossed very suddenly in Del Rio and were essentially put in makeshift camps underneath the bridge by the by the immigration enforcement police. Showed the Haitian immigrants running away from a ICE officer on horseback with what looked like whips, right, with a cowboy hat on. I mean, these images of the West are still circulate, are still with us. And again, while we look at them as a source of cultural pride and defining what it means to be American, we have to understand that Americans are on both sides of that. They're both riding the horse, but they're also at the end of the whip. And so when we see those images, we don't see that those same men on with cowboy hats on horseback have been whipping Mexican people in the border area for 150 years now, and have been enforcing, and again, it's these police forces that were put in place to enforce, slave codes throughout the South as well. So it's not, so again, if it's, we can take the image, but we have to understand the historical context of the image. And all too often we tend to make that historical context invisible, and just take other parts of those images, to the point that yesterday the governor of Texas offered jobs to any of those photographed Border Patrol agents who were seen on horseback whipping Haitian immigrants. He said, "Oh, we're happy to hire you in the Texas Rangers." I don't know what other connection I can make with, what is seen as essentially continues to be developed uncritically in Texas, being a kind of portrayal of a Texas future that is exclusive, that it doesn't include people in the past and doesn't certainly include communities that are here now.
Okay, Dr. Ramos, this is going to be one of our last questions.
Mhm.
How did Stephen F. Austin strive to continue to build relations with General Santa Anna and the government of Mexico after the War of 1836?
Well, so it's interesting. First of all, Austin died sort of soon after. I think he died in like 37 or 38. So Austin didn't live for very long, and certainly he wasn't 36. The president of the Republic of Texas was Sam Houston, and later Mirabeau Lamar, and then Sam Houston again. But and I read about this in my book. On the one hand, the Mexican community in Texas, very quickly gets essentially put into a different category of belonging. To receive land, to receive land script after the Texas, as part of the Republic of Texas, you had to sign a pledge, a loyalty oath, if you were Mexican, that said you were, that you were always loyal to Texas and you opposed the Mexican army. Again, Anglo-Texans didn't have to sign any loyalty oaths, right? Their loyalty was assumed. Mexican loyalty is always questioned, and that was right away. On the other hand, Texas still realized they needed to make money, and they had exports to deliver, and they certainly wanted to continue trade with northern Mexico, the trade of cotton, trade of horses, of horse and cattle, and so Tejanos, Mexican Texans, played an important role in keeping many of those connections going. In an interesting sort of twist of fate, if you will, I mentioned earlier, once after 1847, after 1848, Texas becomes a state in the United States, and then becomes one of the Confederate states that fights to separate from the United States, and during the Union blockade of cotton, the Texas government and also Tejanos were recruited to relabel Southern cotton as Mexican cotton, and sell it essentially on the world market through Mexico as a kind of end around the Union blockade in order to continue to fund the Confederate Army. So the Confederacy kind of turned to Mexico to save them. Now, why would Mexico help them? Well, in this case, because Mexico was being occupied during the Civil War. Mexico was being occupied by the French during the French intervention by Maximilian. Maximilian had installed himself as Emperor of Mexico during this time, and so the same essentially aristocratic, old Europe, old world alliances were activated for the Confederacy. But certainly that was opposed by the Mexican government in waiting, if you will, by Benito Juarez, who certainly was opposed to slavery, was perhaps the first indigenous president of Mexico. He's sort of seen as the Abraham Lincoln, if you will, of Mexico, and certainly he opposed any kind of collaboration with the Confederacy.
And the final comments for you, Dr. Ramos. I'd like to get your perspective of how we can, as HR employees and employees working within diversity and inclusion, how we can help to make our workplace more inclusive of individuals that are Hispanic or Latinx.
Well, that's a great question, and really the reason I do talks like this and feel that history is important. When right now, if the person sitting across the desk from you is Latino, Latinx, all you have to go on really are popular media images, popular representations, even if that, and those representations can be fairly narrow. Again, of immigrant, for instance, when you could be in the United States for generations, multiple generations, right? That the idea that you only speak Spanish. Many Latinx people don't speak any Spanish, right? Again, that it's a very, so perhaps the first thing I would say is one of the things that invisibility has done is it's flattened or almost made Latinx identities very cartoonish and like a caricature rather than heterogeneous, diverse, and as and regionally different, and I would even add, different people coming from different nations, which themselves have their own history. One of the, I think we're in North Carolina where you are, and along the Eastern Seaboard, certainly you have a historic Caribbean-based Latinx population, and so those are specific. Each Caribbean region has a specific history and has a different history. Certainly, you have a large Central American presence, and Central American history is again diverse from country to country. If you're of Nicaraguan origin, if you're of Costa Rican origin, or Guatemalan, Salvadoran, Honduran, you're each of those situations are going to be different. It's going to be a different history with each other, a different history in the United States. It's going to, but a lot of times relating to the United States. Certainly, in the 1980s, the United States was much more militarily involved in Central America. We don't see as much of that anymore. But certainly, U.S. policy, the United States training police forces for much of Latin America. The United States is still involved in Latin America, and so that involvement is still present. So again, so one of the things that studying the past does is it helps you understand how large this history is, how deep this history is. Sorry. Again, I had planned to give a whole part of the talk talking about Florida, for instance, and the history of Florida, which, believe it or not, does tie into the history of Texas at certain points. So I think what I would say is that all those histories are American history, and really what I would push us to do is to think of American history as including all of that versus making it a separate history. And once we see that America is another country in Latin America, that we're all part of Latin American history that way. And I think that'll help us be more empathetic, to see part of a similar history, part of a, different sides of the same coin, if you will. And then finally, just to ask, to say, this is my impression, and am I right? And I think everyone you ask is going to tell you a different story. I'm sorry, Wendy, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Thank you for your informative presentation today. And I've learned a whole lot, and we've all learned a whole lot about more about Texas history, and also the contributions of Latinx Americans to the history of our country. And I appreciate you coming and giving this presentation today. And on behalf of the State of Office Human Resources, we are just again very pleased that you were able to give us this presentation today. I do have some questions that I am going to forward on to you. And I will give you the emails of those individuals so that you can respond to them. But we did get lots of questions and we weren't able to get to all of them. So I'm going to send you that information. And also this presentation will be posted on our site so that you can view it on demand. And I would encourage you to send this presentation out to individuals that missed it. But again, I would like to again say thank you for attending this event. We will have our next Lunch and Learn. It will be on October the 21st, and it will be about Disability Employment Awareness Month. And we will have speakers in relation to disability employment awareness. So look forward to getting information from me about October the 21st and the events surrounding Disability Employment Awareness Month. But as we are in Hispanic Heritage Month, I would like to say again, thank you to Dr. Ramos, and just make sure that everyone is able to view this presentation after today. I will make sure that it is posted and spread the word about Hispanic Heritage Month and also looking into Hispanic heritage throughout the year. Again, thank you for attending our event, and thank you, Dr. Ramos. On behalf of the State of Office of State Human Resources, we're pleased to have you here today, and we will see all of you again on October the 21st. Thank you.
It was nice meeting everybody. Take care.
Dr. Ramos.